The Dallas Cowboys introduced Brian Schottenheimer as their next head coach during their press conference today. We'll break it down on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Landon, the Cowboys introduced Brian Schottenheimer as their next head coach on Monday. We're going to break down the press conference. There's a lot of nonsense that we'll get to in a little bit, but let's start with just Schottenheimer talking. What were some of your big takeaways coming out of that press conference?
I mean, I think you got to see a good look at exactly, who Brian Schottenheimer is and what kind of leader he is and how he commands the room. I think this is a guy that, there's a reason that we have been speaking in the way we have about the guy the last, few days. And, we have talked a lot about the process of him being hired. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But when we talked about Brian Schottenheimer, we talked about the fact that we felt like he's qualified to do this job. He's qualified. We can talk about whether he's the best candidate or whether he's the kind of candidate the Cowboys need right now. But as far as being an NFL head coach, he commands the room. He understands what he wants to do. He has a vision for the team. He's confident. He has a lot of familiarity with the players in this locker room, as shown by the fact that a bunch of them showed up to this press conference today. So I think, as far as first impressions of a head coach go, I really like that he, took a block of time up front to thank a bunch of people. I think that served as a really great kind of introduction to who he was for folks that maybe haven't seen him in interviews or just over the years. So I think you saw an example of a guy who's a football lifer who has been in the league for a long, long time, despite only being 50 years old. I think, we predicted that Cowboys fans would see a lot of why the Cowboys wanted to hire Brian Schottenheimer when he did this press conference, because this is kind of one of the more impressive parts of Brian Schottenheimer. And I do think that we saw a guy that, looks the part for sure. And now the question becomes, like, how does he build his roster? How does the team look? How does the team respond to him? That's going to find out next.
I thought he impressed. And again, that's where we thought he would. He is a very good public speaker. He does a really good job of connecting with players. I wish we could have heard more from Schottenheimer on what his scheme was going to be. We did get to some of that, and I want to touch on that, but I wanted to hear about
Patrick Walker, by the way.
Yep. I wanted to hear some thoughts on how does he view analytics? What does he think of going forward on fourth down and certain game situations rather than some of the other nonsense we heard? But some of the key words that he said that I liked was talked about more shifts and more motions, and how he thinks the current batch of players that he has right now does really well when they play with tempo and that they don't have to go out there and think so much. So he said a lot of things if you were worried about what this offense was going to look like, I think those should encourage you. So I thought that part of the press conference was really insightful.
Yeah, frankly, the way he responded to Patrick Walker's question is honestly, we could do a whole podcast on that whole section of just the talk about the use of splits and motions to muddy up the look for the defense. And I think, that is those are important keywords for Cowboys fans that are trying to figure out what this offense is going to look like, because that is something that has been missing from this offense. Yeah. So I think that that was really, really reassuring to hear those words. And then I think we should have a whole conversation about the tempo aspect of it, because I think, first of all, tempo was one of the few things that this offense did well almost the entire season. When they played with tempo, they moved the ball pretty consistently. And there were definitely different points during the season in which you and I even called for them to use tempo more regularly because it was seemingly very successful when they were getting in and out of plays and not having to overthink things. It felt like they moved the ball really well. So I think reading between the lines there a little bit, and I kind of want to go back and rewatch that part of the press conference one more time. It felt like that was maybe a point of contention between McCarthy and the players and or Schottenheimer is the lack of use of tempo, or the fact that the team wanted to use tempo. So that really kind of caught my eye or my ear rather, when they said that, and just the way that was all being phrased and the way that Schotty kind of harped on tempo there. I think that's kind of where I'm looking for right now, is where are the lines of delineation between the previous era of Cowboys and Schottenheimer? Where are there going to be changes? I think that's those areas that we just mentioned: motion, splits, tempo. These are all things that you're seeing more and more of or being leveraged more and more in modern offenses. And the hope is that the Cowboys are going to start trying to modernize this offense a little bit by adding those elements into it.
Yeah, in terms of tempo, I think like Mike McCarthy this year had to do a little bit of a balancing act, not trying to use too much tempo because his defense was just shattered with injuries, right? But I do think like in 2023, when they were healthy on defense and they had a defense that was creating a bunch of turnovers, maybe that's when they could have used some more tempo. So from that standpoint, again, I'm very encouraged by what I heard from him. One of the other takeaways I saw or heard him talk about was getting under center and using more play action and becoming a better play action team. I think he talked about how they need Dak to be more fit. They want Dak to be under center more so they can use the play action game, and that should help the running game as well. Again, everything he said about the X's and O's stuff, I was impressed by.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what we were hoping to hear from him, right? So we'll see again how that actually translates once we get into training camp, once we get into the regular season, obviously. But right now, at least the vision is correct and where we want to go. I like the direction that they're headed, and I hope that they kind of continue to follow through on that, because I do think that if that's what we're signing up for, is just a kind of refresh, updated version of this offense with just more modern principles kind of, sprinkled in so that you can gain that extra edge. I think that that's something I can buy into offensively, and it certainly goes a long way in making me feel better about the play calling aspect of this whole situation.
The last thing I want to say on Schottenheimer before we move on is I do think it's important to grit your teeth and watch this press conference, because I'm seeing some quotes on Twitter like, I don't love the new head coach saying that X's and O's don't matter. Well, if you watched it, that's not what Brian Schottenheimer was saying. He was saying that the players matter and the relationship matters. And he thinks of it more as players rather than plays, right? Like, how do we get CeeDee Lamb? And again, I'm paraphrasing this, but like, how does he get CeeDee Lamb the ball on a 3rd and 7, right? How do I make sure that my best players are getting touches? We see an Eagles team that I don't think is overly great in terms of their scheme. They scored 55 points yesterday because they have some outstanding talent, and the offensive coordinator knows how to use those talents. I think what Brian Schottenheimer was trying to say there, like, hey, we're going to adjust our X's and O's based on our talent, rather than saying, hey, here's our scheme and you better fit into it.
Yeah, I tend to think that, in general, I understand why Cowboys fandom is upset with the Joneses. Absolutely every right to be, but don't let that anger at the Joneses like leak over to Brian Schottenheimer, who only wanted to have a head coaching job in the NFL, and one of the better ones at that. So let's give Schotty a chance here to kind of prove himself or not prove himself, and try to separate that whole situation from maybe poor process by the Joneses of hiring him in the first place.
All right, let's talk about the Joneses, who did a lot of talking, way more than what Brian Schottenheimer did in Brian Schottenheimer's opening press conference. Let's talk about them next. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind. which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. And that is where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. LinkedIn's new feature can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. And it's no wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That is linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. All right, Lane, let's dive into more of this press conference. One of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was Jerry Jones continued to say over and over how risky it was to hire Brian Schottenheimer. First of all, do you agree with him? And do you think it really is a big risk to hire somebody like Schotty?
Well, I mean, I think if anything, Jerry was responding to, the kind of backlash from his choice. It feels like, I think that there is some risk there. Obviously, I mean, for Jerry, he's, I mean, we saw him today in the video. Did he look like a guy that's got a lot of time left on this world?
There's a chance this is his last hire.
I saw people that were asking like why Jerry is getting so emotional over this, and I think you nailed it. Like, I think Jerry understands very well, like, that this is, we're getting near the end. And again, like, you can feel how you want about Jerry and his stewardship of this team. That's fine. He's earned it, but he's also a human being, and he's, this is a family business for him, and his mortality is very much tied in line to kind of what's going on. So I don't, I blame him for a lot of things, but I don't blame him for getting emotional when thinking about, maybe not having a lot of time left. I think in the risk sense that, look, I mean, it's certainly, you could call the Ben Johnson signing a lot of things, but he's the top candidate, right? Like, that's not risky necessarily. Now, maybe what he's asking for is risky. And I think you could say that about a lot of these candidates that are like the well-tread folks. Like, they aren't risky like as much as any of these other candidates. I mean, there's obviously all kinds of risk in hiring a new head coach in general. I think what makes this risky is that it isn't like, kind of, they are, there is an element of risk by not kind of swinging big for the fence, right? Like, they are still, again, trying to find a way to straddle the line between continuity and change, right? And I think the big thing that I, wanted to hear from the Joneses, and we heard way more from the Joneses than we frankly needed to, but I think the big thing I wanted to hear from the Joneses was what's their argument to why this process went the way it did. Like, did Schottenheimer just blow y'all away? And it seems
that's what
like,
I wanted to hear, right? Like, hey, he was one of our candidates that we really liked, but he just smoked his interview, right? And that's why we went with him.
And look, you and I haven't fully discussed this before we got on the show, but it does feel like that is at least the case that they're presenting, right?
No.
We got a report during the conference championship games from Jay Glazer that the kind of original scope of the way the Cowboys were going to be looking through this coaching search was they wanted to get a defensive-minded coach, and then they had already zeroed in on Schottenheimer being the play caller for the Cowboys. So, like, I think with that in mind, keeping the fact that they had already kind of played that out, and then on top of that, the conversations that Schottenheimer mentioned about what he wanted to do differently with the offense, right? Like the modernizing of the offense. I could see a situation, again, I don't think it's right or whatever, or I'm not agreeing with it. I'm just presenting this. I could see a situation where Steven gets into a room with Schotty. Schotty starts talking about the issues with the offense. The difference is, obviously that he's not going to tell us, the general public, in how he would have done things if McCarthy wasn't, directly above him, if he was the head coach. I think that was probably enough to convince Steven that he should be given a shot as the play caller. And then as they continue to have these conversations, the conversations expanded into head coaching, especially as they looked around at the candidates like Kellen Moore and other folks and looked and said, what's the difference between Kellen Moore and a Brian Schottenheimer, and maybe realizing that there wasn't a ton of daylight between the two, and the reason that Schotty might be a better candidate is even more familiarity with the current roster, and kind of a relationship with Dak that they can work with. So I think that the Joneses kind of laid out their case a little bit. I don't know if it they also tried to convince us that they they reached out to more candidates than is suggested. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. But they at least laid out their case for why they did the things the way they did. And I don't know that it's if it's good or bad. I mean, I think we're going to find out, but obviously whatever they heard in those conversations with Brian Schottenheimer, they really, really liked, to the point where they felt like they could consider him not only as a head coach candidate, but as the front runner.
All right, let's talk about a few other moments from the press conference. Stephen Jones said, some people think we're in a championship drought, and he used air quotes, which I thought was hilarious. He said, some people think we're in a championship drought, as of like to say, we don't believe that we are. I thought that was memorable. Honestly, one of my biggest takeaways coming away from this press conference is that I don't want to say optimistic because that's the wrong word, but I actually feel pretty decent that Brian Schottenheimer is going to do a good job. I just don't get the sense that the front office really wants to change all that much of the way that they believe how to build a team. And I think the two guys sitting next to Brian Schottenheimer are why I feel pessimistic about this entire thing moving forward, because are they going to surround Schottenheimer with the right talent to be successful? I don't know.
It's a good question. I mean, it's a good thought. I mean, certainly they haven't proven that they've been wanting to be big spenders in free agency. Look, we should mention that they did kind of address that a little bit, and Steven did give some deference and said, we were going to look into maybe spending more money in free agency this offseason. We've heard words like that before, but
until they actually do it,
again, I think we've been very clear about how to handle the Joneses. You watch their feet, not their lips, right? Yeah. Like, so if they start acting on that, then we'll start taking their word on it. But yeah, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. Like, we've discussed this before. Like, they feel like they have a formula that they can rely on for team building. It hasn't, been terrible for them at certain points, but obviously that's all kind of come to the head these last few years. So, look, it'll be interesting. I agree. I coming into this or coming out of the press conference, I did feel a lot more optimistic about where the coaching staff is based on, like we said, the things that Schottenheimer went out of his way to mention when they started talking about X's and O's. That made me feel good. I feel good about the idea of Schottenheimer as a head coach, as an organizing principle, all those things. I think that he can do that part of the job. He made me feel a little bit better about where they're going X's and O's wise. And I agree. I think at this point now, if you want to have any kind of optimism that the team is going to get any better, it's got to start with the front office from here on, right? You got to see a real commitment by the Joneses, monetary commitment by the Joneses to kind of go out and make sure that this team is talented. And ultimately, I think that's the big takeaway too from like the conference championship games, is that if you're not going to have a quarterback who specifically is a dual threat there, you need an extra 2 or 3 weapons on your offense to kind of have that element that takes you over the top, that can get you into the Super Bowl. Well, so the Cowboys are lacking that right now.
Even the two teams in the Super Bowl, the Eagles and the Chiefs, they both have mobile quarterbacks, but the Eagles went out and got A.J. Brown through a trade. The Chiefs signed Hollywood Brown in free agency. They traded for DeAndre Hopkins during the year. Like, they've made sure to surround their quarterbacks with a bunch of talent. I think it's time for Dallas to start doing the same. I know there's going to be people pushing for the running backs, and I get that, but it's not just running backs. It's having multiple receivers or multiple tight ends that go out and can make plays. It's time for the Cowboys to do a good job of putting the right pieces around Dak. One more little funny thing from the press conference before we move on. I liked at the very end that Jerry Jones told Dak Prescott that, hey, grab Ed Warder by the neck to show him how strong you are coming off the injury, which is funny considering Dak hurt his hamstring and not his arms or his
Well,
hands.
to be fair, that was more of an age comment because
Okay.
Ed was sitting right in front of Dak when he said, Dak's going to turn 32 this year.
And he actually turned around 32, 30.
Yeah, yeah, he did. He turn around to check with Dak, and I thought Dak was going to smack him too. He's like, "Man, what do you say?" It was funny. So yeah, I do think he's got to show Ed some of that old man strength that he's got in his wrist at this point. So
one more thing that I wanted to say. It's very clear watching the press conference that Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones are aware of what the media has said about them over the last 2 weeks, that this was not an in-depth head coaching search, and Jerry's not taking risks anymore, and that they don't want to win. They're hearing this and they're talking about it. I'm just curious to see if it's going to impact the way that they handle the offseason at all, or when the chips are on the table, do they just go back and act the way that they normally act in the offseason? I can't wait to find out.
I think it's fair to be a little bit optimistic about that too, honestly, because the fact that they're not only hearing it, but feel the need to say something. I mean, Jerry was downright defensive at
100%.
Of this. I think to me that means it's having an effect, and if it's having an effect, then it's working. At least we are having some effect on the Joneses, not none like we all thought. Yeah. And if it means that he doesn't sleep as well at night because he feels like he missed a move or two, I mean, at least it's something.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about what's next for the Cowboys over the next couple of weeks. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling out the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. And with live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. I love betting on the Super Bowl. I don't get into the coin toss, but I do get into the prop bets. One of my favorites every year is the octopus bet, which FanDuel offers, which is when a player scores a touchdown and then immediately scores a 2-point conversion. It hit the last time these two teams met in the Super Bowl. So go download the app today, head over to FanDuel.com to get started and bet just $5 and you'll win. And if you win, you're going to score $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL show. 2 shows every single day. One in the morning with Tyler Rowland, one in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins, available wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Landon, let's talk about what's next for the Cowboys. So they haven't officially hired their defensive coordinator yet, although it sure seems like Matt Eberflus is going to be running the defense. We knew that on Friday night. The Cowboys just had to get past these other rules that are out there first. The next thing is finding their offensive coordinator. And we've heard some names. One of the names that's been mentioned today is Cardinals offensive line coach Clayton Adams, who is, I would assume they're bringing him in to help fix the run game. What do you expect to happen here with the offensive coordinator search?
Well, look, I think we got to remember what the offensive coordinator is doing here, right? And I think listen, I've been doing a lot of these hits and several podcasts. So I can't remember exactly what platform I said this on, but I think one of the things that we talked about is that since this is a situation where this is not a play caller, an offensive coordinator. So this is an offensive coordinator who's coming in as Schottenheimer, in some ways, right? A guy that's going to need to be, head of organizing the offense, but beyond that, he's going to need to contribute a kind of another different angle to the offense. And obviously Schottenheimer being a former quarterback, throwing the first pass in the national championship 1996 Florida Gator season. That means he is more of a passing game coordinator. That's obviously what he did when he was with Jacksonville. That's his expertise, right? So the offensive coordinators that they've been looking at are more guys who could bring something interesting and a run game coordination, right?
Yeah.
Like guys that I think they interviewed is it Anthony Weaver from the Commanders? That's the or I'm
Well,
sorry, I'm not
Anthony Lynn.
Anthony Lynn.
He's somebody that's been mentioned. I don't know if they've interviewed him yet, but he has
Yeah, I
some.
think they've mentioned him, and I think that they've actually officially talked to this guy from Arizona. But both of these guys are what I would call run game designers, right? Like not so much they're off the offensive line coaches, running back coaches who are expert. Their expertise is kind of designing interesting run games. And
Kevin
and
Koger
I,
is the other one, the Falcons
Kevin
tight end
Koger.
coach. Yeah.
Sorry, yes. And so I think that those are the kind of situations that you're potentially looking at. I think is guys who could bring an interesting element of the run game, an interesting way to kind of fix that aspect of it, because I think that maybe is not as strong as the expertise as the passing game is for Schottenheimer. So kind of getting a run game coordinator and then having Schotty as your passing game coordinator is, I think, kind of the sort of architecture they're looking for in that command center for the offensive coordinator.
They also have to hire a special teams coach after Bones Fossil left for the Titans. I believe they interviewed Chris Banjo as their only interview so far on that side of the ball. I'm sure we'll be getting more news here in the upcoming days. And then filling out the rest of this, the defense, right? We know Matt Eberflus. I guess we should assume Matt Eberflus is going to be the defensive coordinator. They haven't officially announced it yet, but everything is trending that way.
Certainly.
But who else is staying? Is Paul Gunther staying, who the Cowboys hired last year to help with the linebackers? Is Greg Ellis staying? What are they doing on the defensive line? What are they doing in the secondary? I would assume by the end of the week, they're going to have most of the staff filled out.
The Gunther thing is really interesting, right? Because Eberflus's area of expertise is linebackers. I mean, he was a linebacker coach with the Cowboys. He was a linebacker coach before that. So that's really where, and obviously he did great work with the Colts linebackers when he was there. So I wonder, but Paul Gunther is obviously a very, very well-respected, long-tenured coach. I mean, if you're ranking, expertise at the linebacker coach position, I mean, he's got to be probably one of the top linebacking coaches in the NFL. So I would not be shocked either way, I guess is what I'm saying, if they kept him because he is so good, or if they got rid of him because obviously there's a chance that Eberflus wants to do his own thing. I would obviously have Cowboys fans that have some extra time on their hands to start perusing former Chicago Bears defensive staff, see if any of them look familiar, and obviously the Colts as well, because I do think that there is going to be some hiring that Eberflus is going to want to do with folks that he's familiar with for sure. Yeah. And then outside of that, I imagine that with Zimmer retiring and not really looking to be moving on anywhere else, some of the guys that may be kind of Zimmer's guys or whatever that came in, they may not have another spot to kind of head to necessarily. So you may want to really heavily evaluate those guys, see if you want to kind of retain them before creating another vacancy, coaching vacancy that you have to go out and fill. I think it would be helpful to kind of retain a couple of these defensive position coaches just because they understand the roster well. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out over the next few days.
Yeah, and the walk-off, Stephen Jones said they're closing in on a defensive coordinator and a special teams coordinator. Again, I would assume we'll get that news in the next couple of days. And then once it's official, we'll go ahead and start to break down what Matt Eberflus's defense is going to look like and maybe what some of the changing archetypes they're going to look for on defense. I will say 3 technique has suddenly become really, really important for this Cowboy position once again.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder now that Eberflus is back if Steven isn't looking at his spreadsheet a little bit more and kind of trying to make some more room for Oso Odighizuwa-sized player to come back, right? Like, I do think that it does make even more sense to try to look at Osa to see if you can find a way to bring him back. It's going to cost a lot of money, so I'm not holding my breath. But even if they don't, I'll tell you what, we'll talk about Senior Bowl guys coming up pretty soon because that's creeping up on us as well. This is a pretty decent class for defensive tackles if you need one in the kind of late first, second, third round area. There are some guys you can get that can come in and maybe give you some contributions if you need it.
Last thing, did you see our guy Deion Walker from Kentucky measured at 6'7", 340 pounds today?
I did.
That's
I
not a
actually
three technique, but that's a nose tackle.
No, it is that. I mean, look, he is a three technique. I that's the thing about him is that even though he came in at 6'7", 330, he plays like a three technique. And frankly, last year at Kentucky, he played mostly at three technique. So I do think that he's someone to keep an eye on, just because even though he is enormous,
I know.
he plays like a three technique. So
Yeah.
someone to keep an eye on for sure.
All right. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. We will be back tomorrow. Check out the channel, download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus _Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.